if we're eating a credit card of plastic every week, how much of everything else are we accumulating? It is such an appealing little snapshot, such a good phrase. Everybody will quote that statistic. It is inaccurate. It is a distortion of the truth.
Ian, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
This topic of microplastics, I've seen a lot of it come through my YouTube feed, my Instagram feed, all over the internet. And on the one hand, I do believe that it's probably a good idea to avoid plastics. I've always cringed if you've ever been in a family member's house and they took food and microwaved it in plastic and then handed it to you, and you could just feel the plastic hot and sort of, lose its sort of integrity. Intuitively, I always thought to myself, boy, this must not be healthy to do. There must be some leaching. And then this has been bore out that when you heat plastic, you accelerate the leaching. So I think there's some argument here, but I've had this intuition that on the one hand, there's probably some things people should be aware of. And from a public health and an environmental perspective, we want to have some guidelines and some awareness, totally. On the other, that there might be a little bit of hysteria where people, like so many things, as we were discussing before we started the recording, we see a lot of this with diet. People go to these extremes, and it's probably, for some people, going to act more as a detriment, extreme dieting, than it is something to improve their health. You seem to have been the person, when we researched guests for this topic, who had the most balanced perspective. And so that's why I'm excited to have you here today and to really help people better understand this issue of plastics, microplastics, how ubiquitous of an issue they are, and what sort of potential detriments they pose to human health.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's because I'm old or getting older. And I've been in this game for a while. And so when people talk about this new field of microplastics and the concern about their health, I immediately try to see that within the context of every other particle and fiber that we've been studying in science for well over 100 years. So in terms of understanding about particles, or fibers in very generic terms, this isn't new. We, have research, we've been studying it for a very, very long time. And suddenly there has been this interest in this new type of particle within the environment. And I think to a greater extent, you see the risk of fashion becoming a driving force within the scientific, and particularly the scientific media's narrative on the topic. And within that, my concern is that precision and accurate reporting of what the findings actually show somehow has been sacrificed, potentially because the perception is it would be quite good if people were concerned that microplastics were bad for their health, because then they might do something about the environmental disaster, which is microplastics, but they won't do anything unless they think it's impacting on them directly. And I think there's been a kind of a subtle distortion that has gone on. And I think it's kind of risky. And I've said this a great deal, that my concern with the research in the way in which it's being presented through the media on microplastics is that it could end up doing the field some reputational damage, because things have been overheated or they've been over-egged or exaggerated to a certain extent. And there probably are really significant issues that need to be addressed, and very carefully constructed questions which we need to investigate. But we may discredit the field before we get to those points, because there's almost like a frenzy going on at the present moment in time in this topic area. And I think probably you've sensed that from the media. I mean, it's kind of an explosion. I do quite a lot of science engagement to the community, and I speak to individuals under the age of 20 now about my area, which is air pollution. They now think that air pollution and every particle in the air is a microplastic, because the dial has shifted, and that's the only word they know.
Right, right. And I guess to some extent, this is how corrections occur. They start with an overcorrection, and then the pendulum finds the more reasonable middle. So maybe that's just the way humans process things, thinking about the limbic system, this sort of danger response center in the brain, and you're not going to really be attentive to it until you recognize it poses a potential danger. So that kind of skews us to this maybe a little bit hysterical positioning, but then we sort of find again the middle that seems to be the most reasonable. But yeah, let's unpack some of this. So I'm sure most people get what plastics are, and to some extent that microplastics are just small particles of plastics that can be aerolized and get into the water table and therefore the food supply. But let's maybe take a step back and give people the overview of microplastics, what they are, and maybe some of the more prevalent ways in which they get into the food supply or other ways they find their way into the human system.
Well, I mean, I always think the interesting thing is just reflect on the fact that before, what, 1856, there are no plastics. There are no man-made plastics on the planet. So when we talk about this topic, we're talking about something which is a relatively recent phenomenon that only really supercharged in terms of, if you like, the use of plastics for consumer goods and their widespread adoption in probably in the 1950s. So it's a relatively modern phenomenon that we've produced a huge amount of diverse plastic materials. And I think we've probably, I mean, I hate to say this, but as a species, been remarkably cavalier in the way in which we handle the waste that results as a consequence of our use of plastics. And so most of that plastic has ended up in landfill. I know people, the narrative here is sometimes driven by people who see all the plastic in the oceans. The pictures of the turtles and the whales surrounded by plastic bags. That's a relatively small percentage of the total plastic which exists in our landfills, which slowly begins to fragment and break down. And then you end up with the dilemma that the very things which made plastics useful, the fact that they're durable and they're resistant, actually allows them to persist within the environment. Now, there are lots of gaps in our understanding, but they're definitely there. They're definitely breaking down. You can show them accumulating in the food chain. The earliest studies, I think, the actual word microplastic was coined in an article in 2004 by a scientist from the UK called Richard Toxin. And in that paper, not only did I identify small plastic fragments in sand and silted estuaries, he also demonstrated that filter feeders sort of would eat this plastic if it was presented to them. And that resulted in sort of like this emergence of a whole series of papers where people measured the accumulation of microplastic particles in, you name it, any filter feeder, a scallop, a mussel, the fish. And then you get this sort of idea of the trophic accumulation of the plastic within sort of like the food sort of net, ultimately ending up in the final receptor, the human, eating the food at the end. And so that's probably where a lot of the discussion began. And perhaps one of the challenges with the fact that the interest in the topic came from that trophic accumulation of microplastics in organisms that we eat is that I think the terminology and the way we describe microplastics is not useful in terms of the way that somebody who's an environmental toxicologist thinks about these issues. So a microplastic is a broken down, fragmented piece of plastic material within the environment, which is less than 5 millimeters in diameter. That's pretty big. That's not really micro by any sense of the word. So they're microplastics, but the ones that people are mostly studying aren't microplastics. Nanoplastics, they have their own definition. That's 1 micron and less, whereas my world, it'd be 100 nanometers. And so we already have a description of their size and a naming which is slightly outside what we would use in other fields when we're studying particles and fibers and thinking about their health effects on the population. And whilst that makes sense in terms of materials that could enter our food, it doesn't really help us when we begin to have a conversation about how much of that material, once eaten or if breathed within air, will actually get access to the human body. And that's really the critical question. If it's out there, and it is out there, if we're consuming it, and we definitely are consuming it, how much of that material actually gets taken up into the human body? The bigger the stuff, the less likely that is to happen, because our body is very good under general conditions at keeping out foreign material.
And by the way, if this has been helpful, please comment and subscribe. This really does help us reach more people who are trying to improve their health. So it is quite deeply appreciated. So there's a claim here that you hear somewhat frequently, which is people are consuming about a credit card's worth of plastic per week. Does that seem to be a meritless claim? Is that reasonable?
Well, it's wrong. So let's just put that straight out there. It's not accurate. And like many of these observations, that claim was subsequently followed by other papers which very robustly demonstrated that this clearly could not be the case. And yet, it is such an appealing little snapshot, such a good phrase. I can go to science conferences and people will still use that at the beginning of a presentation. Do you know we need a credit card? Well, I sit there and I go, well, if we're eating a credit card of plastic every week, how much of everything else are we accumulating? This is a relatively minority contaminant within our environment. If it's a credit card, is it a brick of carbon? Is it, a plank of other chemical materials? It very often the narrative and the way in which microplastic research has been expressed has resulted in misinformation, which then propagates and it sustains itself. It develops a life of its own. That is not true. Everybody will quote that statistic. It is inaccurate. It is a distortion of the truth. But actually, a simple thought experiment should demonstrate to just about everybody that it simply can't be the case. And in a sense, one of my concerns about the microplastic presentation to the general public is it's done very uncritically and very often in a way in which, should we say, the credibility of what has been shown isn't particularly challenged.
Mm, sure. I mean, what's that old quote by, was it Mark Twain who said something along the lines that a lie can circulate around the world before the truth even has put its boots on? So yeah, I've seen similar things there was this one paper about probiotics being administered after antibiotics. And this one group in Israel found that if you take a probiotic after antibiotics, it actually prevents how quickly the microbiome comes back to normal. Now, the vast majority of papers actually found the opposite, that the probiotics were helpful for restoration of a healthy microbiome, and more importantly, from a clinical perspective, reducing antibiotic-associated diarrhea. However, very analogous here, that is still that finding from the Israeli group is still quoted all the time, even though 9 or 10 papers refute that one. So I'm totally with you in the sense that if it's appealing enough, it just catches wind and you hear it repeated all the time.
So to take your Mark Twain example, there's only one thing which is more contagious than a lie, and that's a partial truth. And I think, in a sense, partial truths are part of the problem because we definitely are consuming plastics. People are genuinely permitted to be concerned about consuming something which they shouldn't be being exposed to. And so there's a kind of receptive audience for a piece of information which may be slightly, well, it begins off being wrong and then slightly wrong, and then gradually it begins to gain traction, and all of a sudden you have a complete, well, it's a very difficult to shift non-fact.
Sure, sure. And you make a great point, which is the people who care about their health want to be proactive. So they want to reduce processed food consumption. They want to reduce exposure to toxins in their water and their air. So I'm very empathetic and understanding and encouraging of people doing things to prevent cancer and obesity and heart disease and brain fog and IBS and all the things. So how do we start thinking about this conversation responsibly? And maybe there's one specific question we can ask. So I've heard a few studies that have correlated either a decline in male fertility, male hormone levels, or even gonad size to the levels of plastic in the environment. This would seem like something somewhat intuitive, especially if some of these plastics, I believe, function or can function as sort of phytoestrogens, if you will. So maybe this is one that the audience has heard about, that some of these plastics can disrupt endocrine function. Maybe that's totally unfounded, but let's take this as one case study. How good is the data here showing any sort of correlation between environmental plastic exposure and perturbations in hormone levels?
So I would take it one step back, even further than that, which is absolutely central to all of the science about is there an association with health, is that you have to be able to measure the microplastic to begin with. And it's the Achilles heel of the entire field. They are very difficult to measure in the size range where they're likely to be doing harm and potentially really subject to contamination and artifacts. And I think there's a widespread recognition within the field that there's still a huge amount of work that needs to be done to make sure the measurements which are being made are safe. They really are microplastics. Now, within that, when people talk about microplastics, they kind of, and I still think it's a bit of a problem, obsess about the polymeric particle and the fiber, and they forget about all of the associated chemicals. And for me, again, that is one of the risks of the way in which the narrative has been developed. We have
So
something
sorry,
for which
really
there's
quick.
really,
So what you're saying there is microplastics could be a proxy for a multitude of other toxins?
well, even more than that, I think there's a real risk that many of the measurements of microplastics which have been made probably are not as secure as they've been interpreted within the literature, because the methods are evolving and we're discovering that some of the techniques which were used to measure microplastics maybe could have been measuring other things as well,
Like
which
what
we were
what other
attributing as
things
not.
could contaminate? Because this is interesting. What else could cause a sort of false positive?
So it's if you can see a plastic in a sample, you visualized it. If you want to demonstrate it's a polymer, there are a range of techniques you can use, but they kind of are almost generating a fingerprint of the polymer. But what you see in many of the papers which are being published is that they will take a tissue, if we're talking about microplastics in the body, they will then digest that tissue because they know the techniques can't see the small stuff. They will then filter it after it's been digested, and then they will take the soup which generates from a whole organ potentially, and they will then concentrate it onto a slide, and they might find one particle in, a number of tissues, which they then will potentially measure indirectly by effectively burning it and seeing what comes off. There are concerns that some of the other contaminants within the air may produce similar signatures, or that some of the lipids within the actual tissue itself might produce signatures, little molecular signatures, which almost are indistinguishable from the microplastics.
Really, lipids. So things that we would expect. Obviously lipids are a part of the biopsy sample, the tissue. So that would be a decent amount of sort of noise in the signal of the test.
Yeah, so it's noise, but noise when effectively you're looking at a very rare event in a tissue. People aren't finding, I'm going to say this and then I'm going to have to take it back immediately. I'm going to say people aren't finding milligram concentrations of plastics in tissues when they actually visualize the actual plastics. they are finding the odd plastic particle in tissues, in the placenta when they're actually visualizing it. I'm going to take it back a bit because some of these indirect measurements, which involve not identifying the plastic directly, but identifying chemical signatures after treating the sample, some of those are claiming to have milligram concentrations of microplastics. And some of that data, I would say at the present moment in time, I still need to be convinced of. It doesn't mean that I'm criticizing the people who've done the work. Many of them have used the best methodologies which are available at this time in order to make those measurements. But I think that they are being presented without the caveats which are necessary for people to understand that it's kind of, should we say, a nominal identification.
So then where does this come from? I mean, clearly you mentioned that one paper finding that we consume a credit card's worth of plastic per week has not been demonstrated in further follow-up studies. What does the general body of evidence look like showing consumption of plastics correlates with poor health? Is there any solid science there? I would assume it's in some part difficult to avoid maybe these very ubiquitous baby with the bathwater arguments. We look at a diseased population and they're going to have a whole lot of things like probably poor diet, and because of that they're going to have increased diabetes, and so maybe we're seeing plastics in this diseased cohorts with type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome, but it's hard to sort of tease out, is the disease state due to the plastics, and is there a control group with non-diabetes showing lower plastic do you see what I'm saying here in terms of, is there a control group? I guess what I'm trying to say.
We're light years from that. I mean, we're so far away from even being at the position to have that discussion. At the present moment in time, people are showing plastic particles in tissues. Showing plastic particles, or should we say some of the chemicals associated with those plastics in tissues, does not mean that there's a health risk. You've shown the presence does not simply equate to disease risk. There's always in toxicology the idea that something might be dangerous, but it's only dangerous at a certain level, and nobody knows what that certain level would be for microplastics. I gave a talk which is online about a year and a half ago, and I think I asked the audience at the talk how many papers they thought, how many studies they thought had actually investigated the health effects of microplastics. And at the time I was quite happy, after they'd all stuck their hands up and thought it was 10 or 100, to say that there were none. Again, that's an illustration of just how the distortion of public perception of the field differs from the reality. I would say
sorry,
now
what you're saying is there's so we have studies showing aggregation and identification, even if it's somewhat imperfect regarding the measure. Nevertheless, we're seeing the particles in human tissue, so we're at that sort of step one. But the step two, you're saying that there's a lack, is any demonstration of correlation between those levels and disease states. So are we not even at correlation, or are we at correlation? Because there'd be identification, correlation, and then causation. Where are we?
I can think of one study which was published this year in New England Journal of Medicine, which is a good journal. You would imagine it would have gone through a good, should we say, peer review process, which identified or claimed to identify microplastics in atherosclerotic plaques, and then argued that the outcomes of the individuals who had more plastic particles in their plaques were worse than the individuals who had fewer. So there's a sort of that's the only study which has shown a correlative.
But pretty, I mean, I would say that's pretty compelling, right? I mean, in terms of
apart from the fact that if you go back into the study, then people wrote letters to the journal and pointed out that they weren't certain that the analytical technique was sufficiently robust to be certain that what was being measured was a microplastic.
So back to what you were saying before about the lipids kind of causing a false positive or the like.
Exactly. So, and then you go, okay, well, let's imagine they've got it right. Okay, that's good. Then there's something to be worried about. But why are atherosclerotic plaques accumulating plastics? I mean, if we are, and where is that plastic coming from? Is it coming from the diet, or is it coming from the air? If it's coming from the air and it's a particle in the air, and on a good day, maybe microplastics in the air represent 1% of the particles in the air, then why are these plaques not full of 99 other particles for every one plastic particles that you've seen? Surely then there's a question about why would they be preferentially accumulating these particles? There are so many little questions that observation arises, which really challenge the conception that it's a simple association that they've observed.
Mm.
And then at the end of it, you have the fact that we are making these associations in a field which is still really working out how to make these measurements. They're difficult to make in the environment. They're infinitely more difficult to make in tissues.
Is it, where do you think more of the plastic comes from? I mean, it may be hard to say, but air compared to water compared to food. Is there any decent data that gives us an answer there?
So I've always been surprised by, well, I mean, look, it's going to vary. Yeah, let's be honest. It's going to depend on the individual. When you look at the literature, if you take foodstuffs, for example, the number of plastic particles within different foodstuffs varies. And then there are some which are just screamingly high. The one I always reference is, and I don't know if this is the case in the US, so you'll have to correct me. But in the United Kingdom, you can buy tea, and the tea bags are little nylon bags. And then, it's sold as being, a better tea bag, if you like. You put those in hot water and they shed a huge amount of microplastics, yes? So that tea drinker will probably get most of their microplastics from their tea because they're using nylon tea bags. I think a surprisingly large proportion of it probably comes from the air. But then, even then, you hit this challenge that when I say that, it's because I'm thinking of a particular type of particle within the air, which the field still argues about whether it's a microplastic or not. So if I was to pick something which is a big source of microplastics, which lots of people are definitely exposed to, I would put my money on tire wear. Yes, but the tire wear is very diverse. You have synthetic and natural polymers and
Sorry, what do
microplastics
you mean by
derived.
tire wear? I think there might be a UK US translation. What's tire wear?
Tire.
A tire like
Wheels.
cloak? Oh. So from okay. So I wasn't clear if I was hearing that correctly. So yeah, the rubber in the tire that's going to create airborne particles.
Yeah, and
Ah,
theoretically quite a lot,
hmm.
of the air you breathe in an urban environment near a busy road will contain tire debris. Not all of that tire debris is a microplastic. There's lots of other stuff in there as well. But it's probably a really important source that hasn't really been fully addressed to date.
That's very interesting. So you're obviously then an advocate for if you're driving in anywhere moderate to dense of a traffic situation, you want to have that button clicked where it's circulating the internal air and not bringing in external air, and also not having your windows down.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and it's one of those kind of very obvious and simple things you can do, which potentially makes a huge challenge. But of all of the sources of microplastics, which we are regularly potentially exposed to, that's the one I think which probably, if I was to prioritize, I'd be prioritizing that area.
That's very helpful because I haven't heard that. I've heard a lot about the food supply, and I want to come to that here in a second. But I I picture when I'm driving periodically on the highway, I'll see people who are doing cycling, and I've always thought that just can't be healthy to be riding mile after mile after mile right alongside traffic. And I'm thinking more of the combustion pollutants than the tires in the road. But that's a really insightful piece for people to be aware
It's
of.
it's a really odd thing because I think most people, when they think about the pollution from traffic, automatically do the assumption that it's the stuff from the tailpipe.
Right.
More of the stuff comes from tire wear, brake wear, the resuspension of dust from the road surface. And that will definitely have these both organic and synthetic polymers derived from the abrasion of tires into it. And I think it's just underappreciated. It's one of those areas which, again, is worth studying, but you're starting it from ground zero. And I think it's the only thing I want to keep on emphasizing about this field, that this field is new, but when it's discussed in the media, it's discussed as though it's all a done deal. You know, all the science has been done, all the health associations have been done. And I think that's not quite the case. There may be things to be concerned about, but we need to do the science first. We shouldn't just be rushing headlong with inferences and guesstimations of potential risks.
Sure, sure. Are there other ubiquitous and substantial environmental sources that people should be aware of? You know,
Well,
non-food. I want to come to the food in a
there are
moment,
really
but yeah.
poor sources. Like, for example, and again, I always have to step back, and I don't really quite know what the US scenario would be on this. But for example, in the United Kingdom, we will have waste transfer sites, and those waste transfer sites will collect sewage, fertilizer, dry it, and then they will sell it to be spread on the fields. Well, that material will have concentrated anything like all the microplastics which were in the watercourse, which have gone through, if you like, the sanitation pathway. So I think bizarrely, agriculture and fertilization potentially is an area, and that's one way in which we could get microplastics into the food chain. But I would again point out that when we talk about microplastics, there are all of the other associated chemicals in that cocktail that deserve equal attention.
Would organic food reduce the amount of any of these chemicals?
Don't know. I mean, it's an
Or the
interesting
plastic,
question.
so I mean, obviously, like the pesticides, yes, but the plastic associated chemicals.
When I think about, I mean, again, in the United Kingdom, if I go to a supermarket, one of the things which I always find utterly soul destroying is how difficult it is to buy fruit and vegetables which isn't vacuum wrapped into some plastic container. Whereas ideally you would just really want to get it directly from the producer, and avoid plastic oil. There's no need for it to be involved, apart from the fact that it increases the shelf life of the product.
Oh, and on that, really, really quick, they have at many supermarkets these small plastic bags. So if you're going to get a few apples, you put those in a plastic bag. If you're going to get some broccoli, you put that in a small plastic bag. Would you recommend people just forego that completely? Is that not that's different than sort of being shrink wrapped? We're talking temporary storage from the supermarket to home.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's going to make a huge amount of difference, especially if you're going to wash your food and vegetables before you consume it. I don't think that's a major issue. But for example, if you, for example, think of a fish counter in a supermarket, and you're thinking about the fish, and that fish might potentially have accumulated microplastics, within its tissue as it was growing. It's probably accumulating as much microplastic from the microplastics dropping out of the air in that supermarket onto the surface of that fish. So again, that won't be incorporated into the actual tissue of the animal, and so it can be washed off.
So thorough washing, is there anything in particular that people can do to enhance the efficacy of the washing?
I really think that the reality is the amount of deposition is so limited. It's not huge, that any washing would be good. And in fact, it's not just because you'll be dealing with microplastics, you'll be washing off all other residues. And I think it's better to think about this holistically. It's not microplastics and only microplastics, it's everything else.
Right. What do you, or I want to come to what we can do environmentally, but is there anything else from a food perspective, from a day-to-day lifestyle perspective? I mean, clearly there's some obvious things you can do. Reduce the amount of plastic your food contacts. Close your windows when you're on the highway, right? Have an air filter at home, filter your water. Are there any other low-hanging fruit interventions that you think are worthwhile?
I mean, I don't know, again, the extent to which you have a culture which is dominated by bottled water. Uh,
Bottled
no,
water, sure. Thank you.
yeah, bottled water's a very low-hanging fruit. In the United Kingdom, theoretically, we shouldn't really need it because our water's pretty good at the tap, but there's still a huge market for it and people take it. I do think that perhaps the data on the risks of microplastic within bottled water has been overstated. I mean, there are very few particles. I mean, I was I always make if I'm trying to quantify to get across to somebody how to think about microparticles, and you can relate this to water, or you can relate it to air. But if I'm in an indoor environments generally in the air have quite a lot of microplastic fibers. Some of them are too big to be a health risk, but they're there from your clothing, from the furnishings in your house as you move around. Probably you're going to have maybe an exposure to about 300 particles per day. You know, by the side of the road, you're breathing 20,000 particles per cubic centimeter every breath you take. So it's the number seems big because it's not presented within the context. It would be useful if somebody said, well, there are 100 particles in the air of microplastics and everybody's concerned. But if they then say there are 10 million other particles, then they go, oh, I probably should be more concerned about the ones which are more numerous, unless you can tell me a reason why I should be concerned about the ones which are less numerous. And that discussion never seems to happen. And it's the same with bottled water. What if it's 300 particles in a liter? That's still relatively few compared to the particles from other sources you're going to be breathing as you go around in your daily life.
Right, right. So, in the home, is something like a HEPA filter sufficient to pull some of these out? Especially if someone's, let's say, in a home that's closer to a main roadway or a highway. I'm assuming it's going to be even more important in that situation.
And but not only for microplastics, for all of the other particles. And then, you get back to the point which is keep your windows closed, keep the air filtered if you're in that particular location. And importantly, if you have a HEPA filter, make sure you change it on a regular basis, otherwise it won't work.
And there are some data we looked into this a couple of years back. I can't recall the exact outcomes, but it may have been something like certain developmental outcomes in children were somewhat thwarted the closer to highways schools were. In fact, I think there's some law or maybe even a recommendation to locate schools within a certain distance away from highways based upon some of this research. Are you familiar with any of that data?
Yeah, no, in fact, I have studies doing much the same sort of work. That proximity to air pollution from traffic, yes, has bad impacts on the development of children. I don't think that's a question. And again, that's an interesting point, isn't it? Because here we have very robust science. The air pollution from traffic has an impact on the way in which lungs develop, the way in which the brain develops, the way in which the immune system potentially develops through childhood. All of these observations are backed up by very sound, robust science, not just, should we say, the epidemiological association studies, but they're backed up by experimental human studies, by animal studies, by mechanistic work. It's very, very, very robust. So you look at that and you say, well, we should do something, shouldn't we? We should have that's a very sensible recommendation. We should definitely not be building new schools near busy roads if we know proximity to busy roads is bad for the developmental chances of the children living in those schools. Great. So that should tell you that you should be focusing on those transport related particles. If something comes along and suddenly the dial shifts and everybody's now concerned about only microplastics, And all of the attention and all of the funding and all of the papers on microplastics, for which there's much less evidence and certainly no evidence that that's the component of the near road environment which is impacting those children's health. What you're actually doing is not doing research into what matters the most. You are focusing on something which is niche. Now, it might be important, but you wouldn't put it at the top 10 of the things you wanted to deal with first. You might get to it, but it's kind of distorting the way in which science is being done if it's downstream trying to focus on benefit to public health.
Yeah. No, you're actually motivating me to revisit that research that we performed and do a podcast reporting on some of that because I didn't think and thank you for making me more aware of this. I didn't realize the extent of an issue that was. I found it interesting, right? But I guess I was victim to some of the ethos of you don't really hear a lot about road and automotive pollution. You hear a lot about plastic. So just sort of in the back recesses of my mind where, I'm being biased by what I hear. I thought, well, okay, interesting about this road pollution and proximity of schools to highways and such, but it's probably not as important as the plastics because they hear so much about the plastic. So to your very point, and I think what is causing some of your frustration.
And it's, science has space for people to do research across a whole range of different issues. For me, it's the noise around microplastics is beginning to drown out a discussion of other issues that I think, on balance, at this point in time, are much more mature and potentially have larger impacts on public health. It's become fashionable. I probably don't go through a week now where I don't have to review somebody's grant application. And the grant application will be going quite well. And all of a sudden they will say, and microplastics. And it's there because it's now deemed as being necessary, the important sort of hot topic word to put into your application. But that's not the way in which science should be done. Science should be quite level-headed, a bit grey, a bit boring, a bit methodical, yes? And if you follow that pathway, if microplastics are bad for health, we will arrive at that conclusion and we'll be able to put them into the context with the other things which are within our food or within our air so that people can make an educated decision about, on balance, whether microplastics are more harmful for their health than other components.
Right. Totally. Now, all that being said, I know that you do agree that we need to try to make efforts to reduce macro and microplastic accumulation. Do you maybe want to speak a little bit? So there's kind of two things true at the same time. There can be too much emphasis and maybe dwarfing other things that are perhaps more important, but also I think a need for some attention here too. So what would you want to say to people about what we could do and should do? And we've already hinted at some of that, but anything else?
So at no point am I saying that plastic waste isn't a massive global issue. It's a huge global issue. Ecologically, environmentally, it's a massive issue. It's an issue with a whole host of other things. We need to do something about it. I came across a paper a year ago, and it's one of those papers you read, and it's utterly arresting. Even for a cold-hearted, boring scientist, you read it, and it causes you to recalibrate the way in which you think about things. And it's within this context I view the issue of plastic and plastic waste. It was a paper published out of Israel, and what they'd done is they had estimated the total mass of man-made materials on the planet, and they'd compared that mass of man-made materials. So that's everything: aggregate, concrete, microplastic, everything that we as humans have made. And they compared that against the mass of all living things on Earth. And in 2020, plus or minus 6 years, scientifically speaking, the error margin, was the first time in history there was more man-made material on Earth than there was biological living matter on the planet. And a large proportion of that If it's not waste now, will become waste over the next 20, 30, and 50 years. And then the thing which was really arresting, because that's already a big thing, that's telling you as a species, we have definitely had a profound impact on our planet. And history tells us those sorts of things will come back and bite us, um, usually in less direct ways than we think. But I think the thing which really startled me is that we'd done it in 70 years. If you look back and you say, well, all of this mass production begins in the 1950s, post-war, all of the military industries are being reconfigured to make consumer goods. In 70 years, all the PFAS, all the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, all the plastics, that's what we've achieved in, well, 3 score years and 10. We have managed to fill the world up with waste. And in the Western wealthier economies of the world, we kind of insulate ourselves from the consequence of that to a certain extent, because we have a habit of exporting our waste somewhere else. And so a lot of our waste gets shifted to low and medium income countries. And in those countries, the handling of the waste is just catastrophic. I mean, in Indonesia, which receives a lot of the US and European plastic waste, so that we can be virtuous and pretend that we don't have a problem, they will take the plastic and they will shred it, compress it into bricks, and use it as fuel. Now, if you're concerned about emissions from plastic, I would say be concerned about emissions from plastics, but please start in the places where children are burning bricks of plastic in order to deal with our plastic waste.
Yeah. So we as consumers want to be choosy about how much waste we purchase or how much plastic we purchase that can then produce waste. So opting for not using plastic whenever possible. Water is going to be a huge source. I would assume plastic bags would be another. And I'm hoping that from a policy perspective, we can see increasing shifts and maybe some pressure on companies to find non-plastic alternatives. Are there favorable options there? Because I know what happens sometimes is we solve one problem and we create another. We feel good about less plastic, but now we start using another compound that has equal or maybe even worse detriments that we're overlooking.
That's exactly the point. And that's why, despite all the things I've just said, you just don't rush in blindly and go with the first material which seems like a worth, seems to be the simplistic solution to the problem. History tells us that if that simplistic solution to the problem is monetizing something which is the waste product of another industry, it's probably going to be bad downstream, because that's the history of how environmental catastrophes have happened in the past. We need to be really careful. I often think it's strange that, I work in a biomedical field, and so I'm quite used to thinking about the way in which we do science using a kind of a clinical prism. I believe in the clinical trial, the double-blinded trial, doing things properly and robustly in order to get good results. And we would not, well, there are examples, we would not normally produce a drug and make that drug available to the population unless it had undergone very rigorous tests to ensure its efficacy and its safety. We don't do that with materials. We innovate new chemicals and new materials all the time for commercial use in products. And there doesn't seem to be a tremendous emphasis on demonstrating they are safe. So very often what happens is the compounds are sort of introduced. And in your case, it could be a regrettable substitution. Yes, we are concerned about plastic bags. And so we've invented a new material, and that's a substitution. And then maybe 10, 20 years downstream, we discover that what we've put in place probably was worse than what we started with. If we actually paused and took the same kind of scientific critical view to evaluating the safety of the materials that we manufacture and how they reach the market, and then potentially how they are used and disposed of at the end of their life, we'd be in a much better situation.
Do you see there being any materials right now that have viability? I mean, it sounds like there might be a paucity of research on these materials and the consequences, but does anything resound as an option?
I think there are a lot. So it's one of those terrible things that when we look at a lot of the problems we have, they've emerged through innovation. Yes, plastics are incredibly useful. They have great uses. There's nothing wrong with plastics. The problem is with the way in which we have used them and we have disposed of them and we haven't thought about their lifetime. The same thing has to go forward. We are very innovative as a species. We can innovate new materials. The only thing I would ask is, as we innovate those new materials in the material sciences, there's a greater interaction with the health community so that the materials we innovate are safe. And I don't think that's and if I think of PFAS would be a classic example, the forever chemicals, where they have very, very useful uses. But now, if you look at the lawsuits against the chemical companies who produce those compounds in terms of decontaminating land, the costs to those companies are so huge. You would question whether it was actually really a very good product produced at all. But they wouldn't have seen those costs coming because they didn't anticipate the health effects of it. And that's kind of where we need to go to with material science, irregardless of whether it's a plastic or a plasticizing agent or something we put into the environment. We need to pause, think, reflect, and understand something about its potential consequence to human health, but also the consequence to the environment, because you degrade the environment and then you will have secondary impacts on human health downstream.
We've talked about a number of things people can do to reduce their exposure, and thank you for flagging what I didn't realize was the most important. It sounds like from what you've shared is the automotive and tire associated pollution. Is there anything outside of what we've outlined that you think people should be aware of? Either it be a practice they can put into place, or legislation or some body they can support, because I'm sure people want to try to make their voices heard in a positive way and are saying, I'm willing to help sign a petition or donate to a foundation if there's somewhere I can put my signature vote, my financial resources. Is there anywhere you would point people to? Are we fortunate enough to be that far along to where there's a point people can support?
I think when you have that debate, you have to be careful who you're giving the information to, because some people don't have agency, to be quite honest. Lots of people are struggling to make ends meet, and so they don't have choices very often. So I think you have to reflect on the fact that for people in significant economic hardships, they don't have that many options. That's the reality of it. Many of us who have options can make lifestyle choices, but we're privileged if we can make those lifestyle choices, and we should never forget that it's a privilege to be able to do that. I always think that we mustn't underestimate in democracies the power of the vote and the power to express your opinion. Yeah, politics is a mess. We all know politics is a mess, and you never get what you want, and it never turns out the way you want it. But politicians do crave popularity. And if they feel the wind is changing in a particular direction, they often will, begin to shift their positions gradually. The problem with our political system is that whilst you as a voter have your vote, there are people in the background who also have influence on politicians through lobbying groups, and that's something I think both the United States and the United Kingdom and European governments wrestle with on a daily basis. But if we are going to go to our elected officials and advocate for something, we need to make sure that we are advocating for something with sound scientific information. In the field of microplastics, I think you could quite easily end up advocating based on a lot of conjecture, which would be so easy for a politician or his advisors just to knock straight back because, there are holes all over the place. But being concerned about microplastics and its environmental damage and the things we don't know about it is a completely valid thing to take to your elected representatives. And then, if democracy works, one would hope things would get better.
So there's not necessarily one society or group that you would say support. There's no one who you think is sort of championing this message responsibly of yet. It's sort of a consumer do their best to reduce their own personal exposure, but right now you don't see a figurehead or an association that we should be supporting.
So it's kind of unattractive. It's an unattractive message. I guess what we have to get used to going forward, and this is going to happen anyway, is we all need to live a bit more parsimoniously. Yes, we have to live within our means. As a species, we have to live within what our planet can sustain. And it should be possible to do that. At the moment, I do think as a species, we're kind of like a rather excited child, a bit wasteful, don't necessarily think about the consequences of our action. And maybe we're just beginning to feel the guilt of middle age as a species, looking back on what we've done and thinking about the consequences. But we have to take personal responsibility, because if we don't take personal responsibility, we can't advocate for other people to do it. And I think that's important. And people just having a conversation and having the confidence to have a conversation which questions things is important. I think that sometimes people will try to close down people asking questions about science. It's not how science works. Yes, science is meant to be questioned. It's meant to have the fire of opinion. I may disagree with your opinion, but the argument is part of the developmental process of knowledge, and in science we need it. So if people ask questions and want reassurance about any piece of new science related to health, they're doing the right thing.
Yeah. Well, I definitely agree with you there. And what I would say I will be trying to do is reducing my traffic footprint as much as possible, whether that's if I'm going to order things online, make one large order rather than three small orders. So that's going to be three trips from the delivery guy as opposed to one. Carpool when I can, or just try to, it sounds like really reducing the traffic footprint is probably the primary thing people can do.
And the other thing which everybody always advocates but always makes people's head sink is we do need to eat less meat. But we all kind of know that. But these are adjustments. I mean, I often give lectures to our students, and if I talk about traffic in the United Kingdom, certainly within the cities, there no longer is this perception that you need to own a car. That is more or less gone. People are carpooling, or they are sharing car systems, or they just don't think they need it if there's an infrastructure which allows them to travel. And that's kind of new. And so they can be terribly virtuous. And so I always say to them, how many online orders do you make a week? And at that moment they go very quiet, because you're right. A lot of the modern generations, if you like, pollutant signature is induced by their shopping habits.
Well, for me, I have to say that I'm cringing internally thinking about the prospect of trying to work that out logistically, but um, I now see the importance of that. What is it about meat in particular that poses a pollution problem?
So, I mean, we've only really focused on the traffic component of the particles, but some of the particles in the air are directly related to emissions from the agricultural sector, not from farming equipment, but from actual emissions from fertilizers. So it's a potentially huge impact. Plus the fact a lot of the chemicals associated with agriculture, intensive agriculture, potentially are damaging.
So
And also
are you
just
a
in
proponent
terms
of
of,
organic? I mean, that's not going to solve all the problems, but
no, but maybe I mean, it depends. I think it really depends how much meat. I mean, again, this is the moment I will be, so I could be virtuous and I could say, look, I'm a vegetarian. So, my carbon footprint is very low. And then if somebody wanted to attack me, they could say, but don't you eat soya? And I'd say, yes, I do eat quite a lot of soya. And tell me about the carbon footprint of soya and the amount of virgin rainforest which has been cut down to sustain soya manufacturing. So there's no ultimate virtue here, but certain foodstuffs come with a greater carbon footprint and are more intensive and do more damage to the environment. And nobody should ever restrict choice, but people should potentially be more moderate in their sort of consumption of, should we say, high expense foodstuffs, including the vegetarians with their soya substitution.
yeah, no, I'm glad we're because I do have the concern that sometimes meat is singled out as opposed to other, plant-based foods also contributing. Do you think that supporting local farms? I mean, I'm assuming local farms will, if nothing else, reduce the transit. Because if you're buying from a farm in Mexico as compared to a farm 10 miles away, that is another way to hit that biggest lever of the automotive traffic.
Yeah, absolutely. Plus the fact that you're supporting your local community, which is a good thing to do for social cohesion and for your communities as well. And I would argue that probably any increment in price um, probably is well offset by living in a better, more balanced community. So I would always advocate doing that if, again, you have the options. And we must always remember that some people don't have those
Yeah.
options.
Do the best you can with the resources that you have, for sure.
Exactly.
Yeah. Ian, what's coming down the pike for you in terms of research or projects? Anything that you're excited about?
Well, what am I excited about? But I look, so I should have started by saying, look, I'm studying air pollution, so I'm probably going to say how important traffic-related air pollution is because it's what I study. Yeah. So, yeah, other scientists are available who have slightly different views.
Oh, and I'm sorry, Ian,
We,
on that topic, is there another scientist that you think complements your perspective or maybe even contradicts it so we can have a follow-up interview and sort of get another perspective on this?
yeah, I mean, I would definitely try to contact people who are more concerned about the non-traffic components of particles in the air. Um, and then you could probably pull in, oh, there are many people in the States. I mean, you must have interviewed Joel Shorts.
We're actually fairly new into this realm, so any names would be great. So Joel
Well,
Shorts,
Joel Schwartz is just such
Schwartz.
an amazing and influential voice in the field. And, he's been working in this area from the 70s. I don't think I can think of anybody in the US who has a broader and more integrated view on these topics. Um, so he would be extremely useful. And then there are individuals, I think, and again, you do need to have the other side of the argument. The thing about me saying, I think we need to be cautious about microplastics, and I think that some of the language when it's reached the public has been hyperbolic in terms of how it's presented the data. Um, I would strongly advocate you find somebody who supports that because that's how debate works. Yes, somebody who really believes that this is a significant issue which has you know ramifications. And I might not disagree with them on the details, but I might disagree with them in terms of the presentation. If I think it's we have to ultimately remember if you work in an area which links relatively transparently across to the public, so that really diet, what you eat, what you drink, what you breathe, yes, these things people care about. They immediately speak to their life. You have to present your data very carefully because the public want to hear this, but they need to be presented with a balanced view.
Right. Sure. And then coming back to anything new that you're working on, or any
Ah,
papers or
um,
projects?
what am I working on? We're just coming to the end of an incredibly long study where we've been looking at children's lung development in London because of traffic-related air pollution. In London, we have had policies to phase out the most polluting diesel vehicles. I know in the States you don't really have diesel personal cars, but in Europe, a large number of our vehicles were diesel, and there have been policies to phase them out in London. And so we're doing a study to see whether that policy to reduce diesel emissions in the city has actually delivered benefits to
Oh,
the
I
health
love
of
it.
children.
Yeah, I mean, we want to always kind of correlate the intervention with the outcome. As a clinician, I'm always looking for that. Can you speak at all to what your data? Maybe you can't share this until the paper publishes,
I
but is
can't
there any
share it at the
signal?
present moment in time, but for me, it's critical. Yeah. If you say to me, we have identified compound X and it's associated with disease Y, well, then if compound X goes down, disease Y must go down. Yes.
Right.
It's such a
Pragmatic.
simple
Sure.
piece of logic. And very often in science, you can lose sight of the fact that some of these things are very testable. You have to do them at scale. I mean, this has taken us 7 years of, looking and following 3,500 children over the COVID epidemic as well, which made life a bit difficult, obviously. But for me, it's about testing whether a policy to reduce a contaminant within the environment actually has delivered. And as a scientist, I have to go into it blind. And if it doesn't show that there's been an improvement in health, then I have to go back to the drawing board and wonder what was driving that health effect to begin with. For me, that bit of the scientific jigsaw is often missing. And so it's actually been a pleasure to be able to do that over the last 6 years, because it allows me to just test all of the things I've done before and see if it actually really, really works. And also, if it does work, it will deliver better health to children, which means better health in the long term.
And what markers are you looking at? Asthma, spirometry?
Oh, yeah. So we're doing quite a lot of spirometry, and I could bore you to death about spirometry on a good day. There's so much bad spirometry which has been done in population-based studies where people have dropped into schools and got people to blow quickly. We have done pre and post bronchodilator measurements on all of these children longitudinally across time, so that we have really good gold standard measurements. But we've also done quite a lot of work to make sure that we can estimate the amount of pollution they've been breathing, because that's an estimate. It will always be an estimate, yes. But we've tried to take the science as far as we can to estimate their exposures, to link to the changes in the trajectories of their lung growth, because
So you're breaking
trajectory,
into sort of cohorts, I'm assuming, different schools, different proximities, and you're
yeah,
looking for
absolutely,
correlation.
and a control and a control population outside of the area where the intervention has been done. So it's proper experimental design delivered at the cohort level, and for me that's really important. I mean, because I do think there becomes a point when if you've shown something's bad, by association, how many more times do you have to show that before you do the next series of experiments to understand what causes it and whether you can reverse it?
Hmm. When is this paper going to publish? Because I'd love to have you back on once it's published
I think
and
it's
discuss your
so.
results.
I mean, we're working on the final analysis now. We will be aiming to publish that probably, well, begin the process of publishing. I don't know if your viewers understand, what a protracted and painful process that can be, and it needs to be protracted and painful to ensure that science is robust. But it will probably be being submitted in the first quarter of 2025, and I would hope that by the third quarter of 2025 we would be able to come to press with it.
Okay. I'll make a note on my side to follow up with you around then because I'd love to hear what you found. Ian, this has been very enlightening. Again, the big thing I'm taking away is microplastics, yes, a concern, pay attention, reduce as you can, but air pollution and the traffic associated tire pollutants are more of an issue than I think we are as a healthcare community pointing to and understanding and appreciating. So I will be making some changes for our audience. We will do a follow-up podcast sharing the data. And Ian, if you don't mind, and I'm not going to hold you to this, but I'll send you sort of our brief. And if you if you have a moment and you could go through it quickly and add any insights, again, there's no pressure. I know you're busy with publication, but we'll try to give you a really condensed sort of overview document. Because I'll plan on doing a follow-up podcast on this. And since it's your area of expertise, would love to have you fill in any gaps that we may have missed.
Yeah, no, I think I would really like to do that. And one of the other things I'm very keen to do is to ensure that we have these discussions with physicians so that physicians begin to understand potentially how the environment contributes towards both disease development and the exacerbation of symptoms in chronic disease. I think it's been a bit of a gap in medical education, generally speaking, which deals with the problem once the problem exists, but has always been pretty bad at actually mitigating against the problem existing in the first place.
Yeah. Well said. Well said. Well, Ian, again, thank you for the conversation, for your work. I'm excited about the paper. And hopefully we'll chat again maybe sometime Q3 next year.
Perfect. Well, look, in the interim, have a good Christmas and New Year, and try to relax.
Yeah, same to you.
Take care.
Take care.